So in Chapter 1, we're going to be doing an introduction to coping, theory, and research. I just want to give you a heads up before we really get into this chapter. And that is, unfortunately, you can expect that the first 4 lectures are going to correspond quite closely to the chapters. Far more closely, honestly, than I prefer, given that you're all more than capable of reading, and I think that the chapters are also a little dry as well. So, the way I decided to come to this conclusion is that because these chapters are sort of dry, because you really need to know what the material is in these chapters, despite that, I figured it would be most beneficial if I were to pull out what should be most helpful moving forward in this course. Yeah, that's a hint. I'm pulling out what's most helpful moving forward in this course. And your first exam is in 2 weeks. How's that? My expectation is that while I will always cover some of the chapters within each lecture, I will in the future try to do my best to add supplemental material whenever appropriate to the topic discussed. But for this front end, for the first 2 weeks, we're just going to get through the material. It's important material, and then we'll move on to what I personally consider the more interesting stuff. Okay. So why coping? Why study coping? Well, we see that coping became more important. At the same time, we made better and bigger medical advances. Why is this, do you think? Think about that for a second. It turns out that as we came up with more medical advances, it also gave us more, quote, stuff to cope with. So, for example, advances in medicine mean that people who are born with congenital disabilities or had diseases that would previously be considered high risk for mortality were now living more prolonged lives. And as a result, also living with higher rates of disability or limitations to their functioning. This also raises the question of quality of life. So with these medical advances, so came longer lifespans and increases in individuals living with varying degrees of disability. And that raised the question of quality of life at that point. Furthermore, questions came to light in regards to why one person, person X, with one disability, functions better than person Y with the same disability. And so this raised the question of what's the difference? What's going on here? Why is one person doing better with life than the other when all other things seem to be the same? And so we came up with these ideas of internal coping skills and external resources that could include social support, and that these must interact with the quality of life and chronic illness or disability. And this is what we'll be looking at largely as we move forward in the remainder of this course. So we're going to be talking about chronic illness, as the course title suggests. In short, chronic illnesses are diseases of long duration and generally slow progression. Chronic diseases or illnesses such as heart disease, stroke, cancer, chronic respiratory diseases, and diabetes are by far the leading cause of mortality in the world. They represent 63% of all deaths. We also see that more and more people are living long and mostly healthy lives with varying qualities of life with chronic illness. So in order to distinguish between chronic illness and acute illness, we're going to apply Burish and Bradley's 1983 discussion of what distinguishes between these. And Burish and Bradley say that cause, timeline, identity, and outcomes are really the best way to understand what the difference is between acute illness and chronic illness. So let's start with cause. In acute illnesses, cause is the result of infection, agents, so infectious agents. Chronic illness are typically the result of a lifestyle choice. So for example, smoking will lead to some sort of consequence. So there's a cause. Timeline. With acute illnesses, the timeline is usually brief, usually somewhat predictable period of time that you can expect to have that acute illness. In contrast, chronic illnesses are slow in onset and endure over an extended, indefinite period of time. You can be diagnosed, for example, with diabetes in childhood, and you can live a long, happy, mostly healthy life until the age of 90. Identity. With acute illnesses, generally we have a pretty good idea of what is wrong. We can identify what the causes, we can identify what the symptoms are, and all of those come together in a pretty neat or clear picture. In contrast, chronic illness might not have a specific cause. It could be lots of things coming together or interacting. It might not have an obvious symptom. So, for example, fatigue is something that you see across a variety of chronic illnesses, so it's kind of vague. It's hard to pinpoint. And we see that later, as the chronic illness progresses, there might be more specific symptoms, but that's usually in more advanced stages. Finally, we have outcomes. With acute illnesses, they might be cured over time with proper treatment. Chronic illnesses, generally, they can't be cured, not even with time, and they're going to continue to exist even with treatment for the person's entire lifetime. They're managed more than treated, is I think an easier way to say it. So, some more definitions to understand: disability and stress. Let's start with disability. First, I'll give you some facts. First of all, over 1 billion of people, about 15% of the world's population, have some form of disability. Between 110 million and 190 million have significant difficulties in functioning because of their disability. Rates of disability are increasing due to population aging and increases in chronic health conditions, among other causes. So we can see how, because of our medical advances, we're living longer. And we're living, and illnesses that may have previously ended our lives are extending our lives. And so that's why we have higher rates of disability. Finally, people with disabilities seem to have less access to healthcare services for any number of reasons, for example, transportation or lack of transportation, and therefore they're more likely to experience unmet healthcare needs and to be at risk for further disabling conditions and lower quality of life. So, how does the World Health Organization define disability? Your book gives you a nice definition, and that definition works. I'm going to give you this slightly updated version. So the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health, the ICF, which is what the World Health Organization uses, defines disability as an umbrella term for impairments, activity limitations, and participation restrictions. Disability is the interaction between individuals with a health condition, so for example, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, and personal and environmental factors, so negative attitudes, inaccessible transportation, public buildings that aren't handicap accessible, or limited social support. Stress. Lazarus and colleague defined 3 components of stress: stimulus definitions, response definitions, and relational definitions. Stimulus definitions. These define stressors as acting on the organism from either internal, so example, lack of sleep, sources, or external, environmental sources. The stimulus is further defined by their duration and frequency. So is this stressor acute, time limited? Hospitalization might be an example. Is it chronic and intermittent, so happens every so often but for a long period of time? Is it chronic, as in consistently happening over a period of time? This is the case with chronic illness. Sequential stressors, so this is what happens when, for example, you lose your job, which means you lose your income, and you might lose your health insurance, and you might, as a result, lose your house, and you might not be able to get a chronic health condition treated. That would be a sequential stressors. Response definitions say that stress is a response state of the individual. So this could, for example, include physiologic reactions: headache, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. That is what stress is. It's what it looks like in the body. And then relational definition describes the interaction between the person and his or her environment. So it takes into account not just the literal stressor, the car accident, for example, but also a person's cognitive appraisal of the stressor. Do I think I can handle this? And what coping options or resources I have available to me. Well, I'm talking about coping. What is coping? There's some key points to understanding what coping is. Coping is ever-changing. Coping is flexible. Coping includes cognitive, emotional, and behavioral strategies, depending on what the demands of the stressor are. And coping is not an outcome, it's a process. So let's talk about each of these. Coping is ever-changing. What that means is that coping responds to both internal, so what's going inside of me in my mind, and external demands. It also takes into account what available resources I have. Do I have the time? Do I have the money? Do I have the support to deal with that stressor? Coping is flexible, and so because it's influenced by situational factors, which can vary in terms of the nature, the severity, and the duration of those factors, how I cope with something that is 30 seconds long will likely be quite different from how I cope with a stressor that is 30 years long. And so I have to be flexible in what I use or how I approach that stressor. Coping includes cognitive, emotional, and behavioral strategies depending on the demands of the stressor. So coping can look like a lot of different things. Coping can be emotional. Crying, for example. Coping can be cognitive, or how I think about the stressor. Or coping can be behavioral, what I do about the stressor. Can I solve this? How I cope depends on the external stressors and what internal demands I have, what needs I have, and what sort of resources I have. Coping is not an outcome, it's a process. And that's going to be important to remember throughout the entire course. Coping has both stable characteristics and more process-oriented or flexible attributes. What you want to be sure to think about or to remember when we're talking about process is that when we talk about coping, is that coping is the process, not the outcome. Coping is the road you travel to get to the destination. It is not the destination itself. So, let's talk about the different aspects of coping. Coping is broken down to a bunch of different kinds or forms of coping. Preventative, anticipatory, dynamic, which is present-focused coping, reactive, and residual. The preventative form of coping happens long before the stressor occurs. For example, preparing for retirement in your 20s. It's not going to happen tomorrow. In fact, the stressor may never occur. You may choose to stay working for your entire life, but you're preparing for it long before it ever could occur. Anticipatory. This kind of coping happens when the stressor is being anticipated to occur in the immediate future. For example, I just went to the dentist. The stress I felt when contemplating if I'd have any cavities, and the coping strategy I used playing a game on my phone while sitting in the waiting room is an example of coping I did right before the anticipated stressful event, having my dentist appointment. Dynamic. This is present-focused coping. It's the type of coping that happens while the stressor is going on. I have a friend with the massive needle phobia. Coping for her is the breathing strategy she uses during the blood draw to get herself through that stressor while it's happening. Reactive. This occurs after the stress has been experienced. It's the fallout, so to speak. So the stressor has already happened. Now you're coping with the aftermath. Residual. This is coping that happens long, long after the stress has been experienced and while the person deals with the long-term outcomes or effects of the stress. So, for example, long-term coping of the loss of a parent.